Please go ahead, Bart.
All right. So here we are. So I'll take you to the key question of today, which is basically translated as who actually governs our food system. And I can assure you, you can spend your life on that question. I do, as a scientist at Wageningen University. But I'll not bother you with that. I'll give you the executive summary of my professional career. In 20 minutes, I'll take you through the main topics, the main issues on how we can answer this particular question. Do we actually know who governs our food system? And what can we do about it if we have a transformation in mind? How do we govern the transformation process itself? Can we actually steer food systems towards desired outcomes or not? And I hope you can help me answer this question, because there are certain moments that you can reflect. You can ask your questions for later to Pascal or me. So we already answered this question, and it seems that this particular audience has a preference for actually supporting the transformation from a governance perspective and not necessarily from a technological perspective. Now, I'll take you into that question further. But why do we actually bother so much about governance? But of course, I don't think I have to reiterate the urgency of why food systems have to transform. It's all over the world, be it in the Kenya or Bolivia or the Netherlands. We all want to transform our food systems. And that comes with so deep changes, not only a few policies or regulations, but actually transformation takes so much more. It's about shifts in mindsets, in social behavior, and in new values. And that's not an easy topic. And it requires basically a re-governing of our food system. Now, despite that urgency that we all acknowledge, progress remains very uneven and often too slow, too little, and not adequate to help us achieve the goals that we have in mind as society. There is still persistent undernutrition and etc., etc. And we actually suggest that food systems are not only underperforming, but there is inherent resistance to meaningful change. Now, what is that resistance all about? Why are there certain actors, factors into the system built in that resist the change that we have in mind? So we're going to address that question, but first we need to understand a little bit more for what do we understand by governance? What is the governance of transformation processes? And then are the different approaches that help us steer that transformation into the right directions? Is that possible? And I'll explain to you, I'll reflect with you on one particular approach that is basically about the re-governance of food systems, which is the locking and the unlock concept, which can be quite helpful. So this is me. I spent my years in Africa, 10 years, then at the Royal Tropic Institute, and then some 5-6 years ago, I joined Wageningen University to be a senior researcher in food system transformation. And that has intrigued me all over. Basically, I'm an agronomist by training, but agronomy doesn't explain to me how the world of food systems is actually constituent. So the more and more I asked that question, the closer I came to the key question of today. Who actually governs our food system? So I'll share with you a little bit the key questions. Basically is about who rules the system. Now, I have a Mentimeter question for you. Bram, can you take us there?
Yes, so if you go back to your Mentimeter, I can also share the link again in the chat, and I will share my screen again. We have a Mentimeter question. Bart, do you want to pose it or shall I?
Yeah, the question is indeed if it's all about the changes we have in mind. It's and how to govern transformation towards a higher performance of our food system. The basic question is who keeps us from doing so. So let's take this example. We see lowering food prices in Africa due to all kinds of global shocks. And the key question is then, how is it possible that these prices go so high and make food unacceptable, unavailable to large parts of our population? And do we actually govern the food in our food system well? So the question is, who can we blame for that? And there can be so many stakeholders that are intervening in the supply of healthy food to common consumers somewhere in Africa or elsewhere. And we seem to be having all kinds of actors in mind who can be blamed for these roaring prices.
Although the audience seems strongly in agreement with the fact that it's the government.
It's the government, yeah.
Presuming it's the
private
national
sector,
government.
farmers and government, and look at it. That's a very nice word cloud, but also a bit confusing us. Maybe Pascal can have its observation here. Pascal, can you come in for a second? And what do you think is telling this story?
Bart, what I'm seeing is that there is a big list of actors to be blamed, but the one that is always easier to blame tends to be the government. But also a question is like, who is the government? Who are we talking about here? Are the people we elect, or are the institutions that are somewhere that not connected to us? So I think I lean towards actually we can blame a set of actors, so the system, and how those systems are built and the incentives around that. So the government, yes, it is the easiest to point a finger to, but maybe throughout my example, my experience that I will share later, I will show you that maybe sometimes the government itself does not know what is the right solution, and it's the responsibility of all these actors to come together and find solutions to our food systems and our challenges in food systems, including food prices. But it's interesting to see that the list being that large.
Yeah, thank you. I'll go back to my presentation. And continue from here. Okay, I have to restart my... Yeah. So, very diffused answer, but basically that is actually reflecting what we understand by governance. Because governance is not the same as government. It is the collaboration between certain stakeholders who together rule the system. That can be one, but it can be more. And I think your answer to my question was indeed a kind of constituency of multiple actors who together create a situation where these roaring prices can still happen. So, food system governance. It's the question of who controls a food system or who benefits from it. Or basically, if we want to study it, it's the political economy of food systems, the study of all the forces, the relationships, and the power of actors in an economy, in this particular case, a food system. So that's quite a conglomerate of actors and rules and institutions who together form the particular constituency of a food system through which a food system is being shaped. So it's not only the government, it is a particular set of actors who share their objectives, their different perspectives, but also use their power to shape the food system according to their interest. And it can take form at different levels. You have governance at local level, governance at medium level, and governance at national levels. You even have governance at global levels. And each level has its own set of actors who dominate and who set the rules of the game. Now, if we look at what are actually the main key challenges as to governance of a food system, we come to particularly 5 issues. I'll go very quickly through them because we have a bit of a limited time. But basically, it is about how can you develop and implement multi-sectoral policies, because governance can be also very fragmented, not in coordination, not tuned to solve a particular problem because of the fragmentation of different powers and different actors. If they don't work together, it's very difficult to address that issue, which requires an interdisciplinary approach of working together to solve it. Very often, food system governance is dominated by the private sector, and private sector and public goods not always go very well together. So if we set in motion a process of transformation that serves a public good, and the private sector is the key dominating party, how can you assure that the private sector, with all its interests, which we can understand, aligns with our demands from society? And that's basically about balancing interest, because the governance of food systems is about different actors having different interests, and how can you merge them together for a more common set of goals? It's about power, agency, and also giving voice to those who are underrepresented. Because if that is an inclusive process and the actors with a strong interest have no voice, however can you then achieve a common goal? Maybe that's the most important, the most critical question, is that alignment of interest to achieve that goal that we could share together. And then in particular situations, governance can have different forms. Formal governance, which we seem to refer to as the government and certain visible stakeholders of companies, etc., may act in a different domain than, for example, in the informal economy, where different actors rule that particular subsystem. And if we do not align the governance of one subsystem, like the informal, with the formal ones, we don't get very far in achieving a common goal. Now, transforming is about re-governing. It's about how do we actually set the goal that we have in mind? Is there something like a process where at the beginning the interests of different stakeholders are being acknowledged, and that we create a joint understanding how particular interests can be aligned? It's also about moving from a situation which is actually undesired because the system doesn't perform according to our expectations, towards a higher level of performance together. And that goes through a phases of instability and deconstruction, where a new equilibrium between actors has to be achieved. And that may be a very, very important and difficult question, is how to navigate from one equilibrium, which is unsatisfactory, to a higher level of equilibrium, which we desire. And that transition or transformation, and how we govern that transformation, is basically the most important question of these days. Because it's not an easy process. There are so many trade-offs possible that can appear during that process of navigating from one equilibrium to another. And it's about, restructuring, redistribution of benefits, different costs and risks. And some of these key actors will benefit while others will lose. That's inherent to any process of transformation. And don't take that too easy, because many, many transformations come with a lot of resistance. And we have to acknowledge that, because political economic resistance is not irrational. It reflects the status quo in which power relations, material interest, and institutional lock-ins and particular risks are embedded in the current system. If you want to change it, you have to take along those who would like to change, the change agents, but don't forget about the resistance. And that's maybe one of the lessons that I have learned from my practice, that we seem to overestimate the power of innovators, the change agents, those who are already convinced that the change must happen. But then, if we don't pay due attention to those who stay behind, which actually lose with their transformation, or are not actually convinced that even the change will also benefit them, then that transformation that we have in mind will never happen. So early mediation of potential resistance is key to the governance of that change process. And if we don't do that, you will see that many transformations will actually not take place at all. Now, taking that as noted, there are so many ways that we have developed concepts and theories about how pathways can help transform food systems. And these traditions and opinions, they differ fundamentally. How we look at society, how societies can change, how food systems actually can change. And there seems to be a huge debate about how to approach the governance of such change processes. Even we in Wageningen, we have multiple approaches. There's not one single approach to how to govern food system transformation. So just to show you a little bit what are common practices, common theories and concepts that we use in Wageningen, we already came to identify 7 approaches which coexist and can be applied according to a particular situation, a transformation process, a particular level, or a particular context. And none of these approaches are superior to any other approach. They can be applied and deployed in any situation, but be mindful that there is not a single approach that solves all the questions of governance of transformation. So I can refer to system lock-ins as a very useful concept, but in other situations, you may be more benefiting and understanding a particular challenge by your foresight analysis with multi-stakeholder processes or the small wins approach. I just mentioned a few. Now, what these approaches, these 7 approaches that we deploy at Wageningen University and Research have in common is that they all focus on system change and that they are actually acknowledging that such change processes are never linear. They are never simple cause-effect relationships. There are often feedback loops and sudden shifts possible. We are looking with these approaches to the leverage points in the system. Where can you push? Where can you expect a dominating effect by pushing on one part of the system to multiply its effect through the whole system? But it's also about acknowledging uncertainty. And because we never know the future, we never can exactly know what will happen. And every context has its own dynamics and uncertainties which need to be accepted at the beginning of the process. So we have to think about scenarios, different scenarios from what will happen if we do nothing and what could happen if we do this, and what will be the effect, what will be the synergies, what will be the trade-offs. That will help us to understand more strategic actions and highlight that during the process of transformation, the governance of the change process, we have to be flexible and keep on understanding what's exactly happening, because we cannot predict how societies will altogether respond to particular impetus or interventions. So it's about continuous learning and to understand what actually is going to happen during the process of transformation. And that cannot be steered by one particular actor. It is again the multiple actors that together co-govern that system of transformation. Now, one particular concept that helps us understand the governance of food system transformation is actually the concept of lock-ins. And that refers to situations and transformations that are actually stagnating. Very often, we can also have transformations that are enforced and happen slightly the way we have predicted. Those are quite unique. But in many situations, a transformation process is not going as smoothly as we would have hoped. Because of the resistance, because of the particular political economy of the food system, there are resistance, and there is a constituency of stakeholders that would prefer to keep the status quo as is. Now, in such situations, we refer to lock-ins. Lock-ins are actually self-reinforcing dynamics of the status quo that keep the transformations from moving towards the sustainable, equitable, and resilient systems that we have in mind. So it's a concept that has gained traction in other sciences and are recently more and more applied to food systems. And it helps us with a clearer understanding of food system transformations and the leverage points in the system that we can push on, leading to the design of more appropriate interventions, where we actually acknowledge that resistance is there and that we deploy particular incentives to overcome that resistance. Well, there's a lot of theory about it. I'm not going to detail that, but basically, the last reference which I will use is that lock-ins can be very well understood if we take them as a starting point of our analysis and ask ourselves, why do certain stakeholders resist the transformation that we as society would like to achieve? And then there are basically 4 different causes why people resist. It can be material, financial, because they will lose their financial assets with the transformation, or at least they think they can lose it. And they don't have a different business model that can also benefit from the transformation. Of course, that inspires people to resist because they will lose their income or their revenues. So I'll come back to that. But there can be also institutional lock-ins because the law, the regulations in a particular context does not allow for that transformation to take place. But also behavioral. The behavior that we have adopted over the years can inspire us to keep things as is. Or even discursive reasons can keep us from moving from one situation to another, because it's our belief that it is not good. And that can be challenged at certain situations, because in the new situations, there are also ways that you can change your convictions about what is bad and what is good. Now, unlocking system diagnosis could look like this. First, look at what is the historical context of a particular lock-in. And where was it, did it establish, and why did it develop into a status quo that is satisfactory to certain stakeholders? So what's that lock-in? Who are the key actors? And how do they deploy their power and influence to meet their interests? And how are they related to other stakeholders? And are there other path dependencies, meaning institutions around these key actors who go with the status quo because they are also influencing the maintenance of a particular situation? And sometimes it's about the use of hazardous pesticides, for example. We all know that they are so hazardous, but still we keep on using it. And we can even see that certain research confirms the use of those pesticides, which creates a path dependency from which is difficult to change to a modus of more healthy situations where these pesticides are being taken from the market. So it's all referring to a lock-in with different actors and different positions in those lock-ins. This takes us then to the understanding the resistance. We can analyze the root causes of that resistance, which takes us to, are there then also incentives possible that we can think of to overcome these resistances? And then, it's not just about blaming people for their resistance, but it is from understanding the rationale of resisting and whether we can design our policies and interventions in such a way that the resistance loses its influence its root cause, and they can go with our transformation process. And that's basically how food systems can be regoverned, including those stakeholders that are not at the start of that transformation process or are resisting. Now, that brings me to a key question that we would like to ask. Is this the right moment, Bram, or do we keep it for after my presentation?
Yes, I will share the link in the chat. We will not show the results yet, but we will come back to the results in a bit.
Yeah, so I think everybody can use the Mentimeter link, and you can...
In the chat, indeed, yeah.
Yeah.
So, and the question is, can you give an example of, from your country, of a food system transformation lock-in?
Yeah. We'll wait a few moments just to allow you to think of, hey, a particular lock-in, a situation where a transformation could happen, but it's not. Which poses questions on the governance, who is actually behind that transformation and who are resisting. And how can that resistance then be addressed? But that question we keep for your reflection, but particular lock-in.
And be specific in your answers, because I see some very broad terms like policy come in. Which kind of policy are you talking about?
What is the lock-in? What's the lock-in? What is the key change that you have in mind which is not happening? Be specific.
I think you can move on. People can reflect in their own time. Yeah.
Pardon?
I think people can reflect still a bit and put it in the Mentimeter.
I'll go to conclude my presentation. So if I can summarize my journey from being an agronomist to studying governance and food system change, how can we make systems change and get out of that lock-in into a mode of navigating towards the desired goals? The basic question is indeed, who is actually governing my food system? And who's not? Whose interests are being served and who's not? Who are actually the change agents in the system? And those who are willing and able to move towards a higher equilibrium, and who's not? Who will resist? Who will lose with moving to that higher equilibrium? It's about understanding what keeps them from being part of the change process. How is it, why it is difficult to include them in our process of regoverning? And that's actually the key to progress. Making progress is all about acknowledging that particular stakeholders are not part of the process of change. They cannot even benefit from it. They will put up the resistance. And if we want that change to happen, we have to address the root causes of their resistance. And an early buy-in of these actors who may resist is actually about avoiding that such resistance will happen and that situation may polarize. Basically, it's the key to a successful transformation process that can be regoverned. That brings me to the last question, which you can take home. You don't have to answer it right now. But basically, the story of governance of food systems is all about a key question that I would like to pose to you. Is it about changing the rules and not the parts? And will the system then transform itself? Well, you can take that question home, and I would like to give the floor back to Ezra as our facilitator of this conversation.
Thank you very much, Bart, for the very insightful presentation. Taking us along on this journey indeed from governance to regoverning to talking about change agents, but then also about the lock-ins and addressing lock-ins as a means to facilitate. transformation. I think I see many comments in the chats of people having learned about the first time about the terminology of lock-ins. I think quite a few people learned quite a few new things in this presentation, also probably reflected by the clapping hands I see passing by on my screen. I also see a couple of questions emerging in the chat. Please keep them coming, put them in there. We'll get back to that after the next speaker. I also see a couple of interesting remarks about potential lock-ins in the chat, but I think, Bram, perhaps this is the moment that you can share the insights from the Mentimeter and to have a look at what you all put in there in terms of lock-ins. And that's quite a lot, I guess. And I would like to ask Pascal to perhaps have a first reflection on all the different examples or types of lock-ins that are put here on the screen.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ezra. So I'm seeing bank loans, so financial inclusion, challenge of misunderstanding among stakeholders. So I assume that is an issue of communication among stakeholders, trying to understand who is doing what and how everyone's initiatives can be aligned and avoid duplications or working in the silos. The cultural belief that meat should be part of every meal. Okay, yeah, there are cultural considerations, unregulated informal sector, tough laws and regulations, poor agriculture policies, high import dependency, Kenya food systems heavily centered on maize due to policy support, subsidies, cultural preference, which crowds out other nutritious cereals, early investments to earn back, so no money to change. So I see a lot of political economy lock-ins, but it's also interesting to see how the group is coming up with these lock-ins. It means people in this course are actually observing and seeing what's going on in the ecosystems and seeing where these lock-ins are coming from. So policy barriers, cultural norms, financial challenges, which they are all correct. But I think it's also important that we try to think like more concretely when we think of like, when you say like a market, what exactly does that mean? Like lack of knowledge, what does that mean? Because I think the more concrete we think towards like a particular lock-in, it becomes easier also to start thinking around solutions. So if it is a market, is it the pricing? Is it the market in general? Is it specific markets, domestic, international trade? Keep thinking around that, but try to be as concrete as possible because that is the best way to start also thinking about potential solutions.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, very nice. And also seeing the chat, but it's also reflected on the screen of the Mentimeter, right?
Yeah.
Examples of big, powerful lobbies being mentioned as obvious candidates of lock-ins, of course. So very interesting stuff. I mean, Bart, do you want to have a very brief reflection on this before we move to Pascal?
Yeah, some of them are the real lock-ins and some of them are the root causes. But I think the very helpful example, illustration is the payback time of investments. So you made an investment and the next time, the period after, you cannot change your practice because you have to, the buyback time, the payback time takes 2, 3, 4 years before you have repaid your investment. In that period, you are being locked in. Unless somebody offers you a way out, who says, "Hey, I'll take your payback time. I'll subsidize the loss that you're going to make, so you can move again." So very often lock-ins are very rational, and we are all subjected to certain lock-ins ourselves.
Yes,
but it can be also cultural. It can be belief, and those are maybe the most difficult to change because belief of a certain practice that maintains a status quo yes, I'm doing that all my day. My father did it, my mother did it, so I'll do it also. How can you change that? And that is a particular root cause that is quite difficult to address, but not impossible. We have all changed our beliefs over time.